Hello and welcome to our Tecnoglass Call to Order series. This is our second event this term, and we'd like to again thank our sponsors, Tecnoglass, who are making this possible for us. So we continue with the theme. As you know, the Call to Order series is a focused series. We have an annual theme, which will change every year. Whereas our current series, which hasn't started yet, is more eclectic and more opportunistic, actually, in capturing the talent that the school is able to bring to Miami. So, as you know, the theme for this year is the call to order, meaning a look at what we see as a reinvestment in the foundations of the discipline. Something that we actually see rehearsing perhaps the ethos of the 70s, the neo-rationalist moment, where architects regrouped and regrounded on the foundations of the discipline. In response to what they saw as an erosion of architecture due to the discipline being pulled in all directions, with behaviorism, social sciences, etc. There was a kind of regrouping, a call to order, which reestablished the practice upon the solid foundations of the discipline. So we looked around and we saw similar symptoms. I say symptoms because these may be mere just visual, formal manifestations of formal echoes of neo-rationalism. And actually the series has partially to do with discovering more. We want to know more about this. Is it really just a formal project, or is there an affinity with the spirit of the neo-rationalist movement? Is there really a commitment and reinvestment in disciplinary foundations? This is what we are trying to discover. And we are interested in it because we are interested in these questions because they resonate with what we see as the core preoccupations of our school here. So we are interested in this renewed interest in historical precedents, in typology, and we saw this coming from all different new directions, and we think that we have perhaps new interlocutors who are thinking of these issues in completely different terms, and that we should perhaps maybe interrogate and explore more. Okay, so today we are addressing all of these questions in a very concentrated, intense fashion with 3 presentations by 3 different architects. And it's a bit different today because, for instance, last week we had Machado and Silvetti, who basically showed us how they have been sustaining that commitment, basically reinventing it continuously, adapting, for instance, their typology to the new conditions of productions, to the new landscape of practice, with notions such as emergent typology, which addresses the changing conditions of architecture in North America, or unprecedented realism, in order to allow for innovation, basically within that typological paradigms. But today, we are not looking at someone who is trying to really sustain and reinvent with every iteration this obsession. We are actually looking at younger practices, a new generation that has deliberately chosen to look at this. A generation which ostensibly seems is wary, perhaps, of the allure of the new, and is a bit suspicious of this notion that every building has to be a total new invention, a total unique response to particular conditions. That's the notion of the diagram, which has had an incredible influence, I think. It's a very pervasive notion, which is very powerful and interesting. But we see now a new generation of architects who are thinking that we really don't have to invent everything from scratch again, and buildings do not have to be unique, diagrammatic translations of the forces that shape architecture, that there are things that are more lasting and that they have to do with a typological repertoire and a historical resonance. So, we have 3 practices today. They're very different. Of course, it's very, whenever we put these things together, it's a very artificial, basically, process, because we assume that they're going to all address that particular, that core question that I'm putting here on the table. But of course, we will see, no doubt, that they are thinking of this in completely different ways, and that's what's interesting. We want to open the discussion rather than actually confirm certain suspicions or prejudices we have already and that we are bringing to this debate. So we will start with Wonne Icks from Productora. This is a very interesting practice from Mexico City that has 4 partners with 4 different nationalities. Our speaker tonight is from Belgium, but the others, Abel Perez from Argentina. I'm butchering the pronunciation of their names. Carlos Bedoya from Mexico and Victor Jaime from Mexico. I quote from their mission statement: Productora's work is distinguished by an interest in precise geometry, the production of clearly legible projects with limited gestures, and the search for timeless buildings in their material and programmatic resolutions. Of course, all of this resonates with the things we appreciate at the School of Architecture here. Adrian Pfeiffer, who I know very well, is Romanian-born, teaches at the School of Architecture and Urbanism at the University of Toronto's John H. Daniels Faculty of Landscape Design, and has a long title, Architecture, Landscape and Design. Before launching his own practice, I have to mention that he had an amazing track record in winning several international competitions, or at least placing in some of them. And before then, he actually was working with some of the most prestigious offices in Toronto, including Baird, Sampson Newitt, and Moriyama Teshima. Also on the side, he is a principal in a firm called the Flat Side of Design, which actually collaborates with architectural offices in Toronto to help them produce sumptuous, amazing presentations. Another day, actually, we will ask him to come here and lecture on this particular activity, which I find very interesting. Now, Carie Penabad is one of us here. She's a professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture and a principal partner with Adib Khoury in Khoury Penabad Architecture and Urban Design, a Miami-based firm which has received many prestigious awards, too numerous to name, but I just want to mention the Silver Medal Prize for the 2010 Miami Biennale. And also I want to mention that recently the firm was a finalist for the Marcus Corporation Foundation Architectural Prize for Emerging Architectural Talent. She has had appointments in several academic institutions, most notably the Luis Kahn Visiting Professor of Architectural Design position at Yale University. Okay, so we will start with Productora, and each one will have 20 minutes. We will keep the questions to the end. After the 3 presentations, I will have discussions with our presenters, and then we will open it to you guys to continue the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolphe, for your introduction. I think I should not speak much anymore. I think it's a very precise introduction, and it's very. I have this strange feeling as well. This presence of this 70s ethos, forms, interests that all of a sudden seem to be here and now, and I share these questions. I hope that maybe between all of us we can enlighten ourselves a little bit on that theme. It's a very basic way. I kind of decided to divide the presentation up in 3 different themes. As you know, I speak here on not on behalf of myself. I speak here on behalf of my office, Productora, myself and my 3 partners, Carlos, Abel, and Victor. Okay, let's start. Context. I like to start sometimes with this image. This is an image of the 1950s. It's a house from 1952 in Mexico City called, I think it's actually called Casa Gomez, but we always call it Casa del Risco because it's in the Calle del Risco in the Pedregal area, actually one of the areas that is developed by Barragán. And I sometimes show this image because for those who know our work, our buildings are very blocky, very sturdy, very geometric, very precise. And one of the questions we sometimes get after a lecture is, what about context? Are you not interested in context? And I think yes. I mean, the only thing that there's really to work with as an architect is context. But there are like different ways to work with it. And especially in this house by Artigas, I think there's a very good example how you can make this context, how you can make this natural environment only more powerful by, in a certain way, not engaging with it and kind of superposing your building as this very abstract volume on top of these volcanic rocks, creating only more tension between the architecture and the underlying geographical condition. Of course, also because of you, Adolphe and Adip and Rodolphe, I started with a project in Beirut. This is a competition we engaged in a few years ago for a House of Arts and Culture in Beirut, in Lebanon, Beirut. The site is very interesting. It's almost sort of a square site next to an intercity highway, and just below the city center, which is more up there. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not. I mean, I know Beirut through aerial views in Google Earth, not more than that. And the competition basically asked for theater halls, 2 main theater spaces, art space, a cinetheque, a movie archive, and a movie theater. So what we started working with in one of our first initial concept models, we kind of came up with this idea in which we thought that a superposition of different layers of columns could create a very, very interesting space in which, like, the more interior spaces are protected by these outer layers. This whole composition would kind of look as a sort of, almost as a sort of veil, like a sort of theater curtain that could one way or another represent a building. Here you see the same for the original diagram on the left, where you have like this idea of these superimposed layers of columns, and on the right you see already how it's like molded into architecture with towards the inner city highway, this dense layering of these columns as a sort of almost like sort of acoustical buffer towards the street side, while towards the city center you could have more open spaces and terraces that could engage with the city fabric. Here you see a sort of a rendering of that idea. Now this closed composition here and these open terraces towards the city. A model image of the same. And we kind of could imagine that like these 3 layers of columns could kind of generate a play of the sun during the whole day and like casting these different lines of shadows, creating different compositions during the day. Here you see, for example, a side view where you can almost have a sort of stepped pyramid composition and where then these terraces could be like protected terraces underneath this cantilever, underneath this roof supported by these extremely slender columns. And then another view. I tried to go a bit quickly. I tried to also not to go in too much into detail or like theoretical reflections. I think we'll have more time for that later, and I'll try to show a bit the work so we have something we can talk about. The Diaz house in Valle de Bravo. It's a very beautiful site. It's a site just in front of a lake, about a 2 hours drive from Mexico City. And of course, one of the conditions of that we wanted to work with, as we said, we should use very long volumes so we can have as much as possible contact with the water. Here again, these very obvious decisions to relate in a very basic way with this context. And then we kind of try to resolve this different stacking of volumes in a way that each volume could have access to to the roof of the next volume. You can show it. Here, this is an aerial view. We had to hang one of our photographers from a paraglider since we didn't have helicopters, so we can. It's very beautiful because the paragliders, they land just on a land tongue just in front of the house, so you see them coming down the whole day just in front of the house. And then here you see basically how this stepped volume kind of resolves the sloped piece of land and kind of connects the upper street with the garden below. From the street, from the little town, due to certain urbanistic requirements, but also because we kind of think that it's perfectly okay that this house has a sort of schizophrenic nature, in the sense that from the street side, actually a lot of the houses we made, they kind of work in that way. That from the street side, it kind of becomes part of the city, it becomes part of this whole environment, and then when you enter the house, when you enter the architecture, the more complex relationship starts to unfold. No? So here you see the view from the street side, small openings, the natural stone, the white walls, even like this fake wooden, it's a concrete roof with wooden blocks glued underneath it. And then from the other side, almost simple dynamic stacking of these modernist volumes. I will not go into much into the details. It's of course a pleasure working in Mexico because you have very, very, very good blacksmiths, carpenters that can really, and you can design all these details on site together with them. Of course, in order to kind of emphasize more still the stacking of these different volumes one on top of each other, we kind of try to detail these things out so you could really see the thickness of these concrete slabs one on top of the other when these volumes intersect. This is another image. This is actually a picture they just sent to me today, and it's structure. Structure, and of course in the 70s ethos is also very important. The tectonics of buildings is a very important aspect. And now that I'm teaching in UCLA, and I'm living part-time in Los Angeles and part-time in Mexico City, I start to be more and more aware of the conditions we work in Mexico City, and the difficulty of building in Mexico. One thing that for us is very clear, since the budgets, since the political situations, since the overall condition in which we work are so unstable, we always try to guarantee quality in our buildings by guaranteeing that the structure already defines the whole architecture. With that, I want to say that whenever the structure is finished, I think the building should be almost finished. This is a very simple trick. Nobody will change plans approved by a structural engineer because they're signed by the structural engineer, they're approved by the government, they're approved by the local municipality, and they involve a risk on security. If, as an architect, your architecture depends on final detailing, on materializations, on adding certain decorations, then what can happen a lot of times in Mexico is that through budget cuts in the end of the project, these things will not be realized. So basically what we try to do is an architecture that at the moment the main structure is built, it is almost finished, let's say. A good example actually is this competition we won in 2008 together with a good friend, colleague Lucio Munien. It's a competition in Caracas, Venezuela, for the CAF, the Corporación Andina de Fomento, a financial institution. And basically the piece of land we were supposed to design, we had to design 500,000 square meter of parking, office spaces, auditorium, meeting rooms, gym, etc. was this piece of land. It's a very complicated situation, as you can see. I mean, when we arrived at the theater, was already demolished. There was an old theater there. But for example, this is the piece of land. And as you can see, the urban morphology, the urban situation kind of demands this space to be a public open space. All these buildings are looking inward to this plaza. So we started to kind of see if we could develop sort of system in which this plaza would stay open and accessible to the public. We kind of thought at a certain moment it should be a floating, hovering volume, sort of cube floating over the plaza. Sometimes we said, yeah, maybe it should be sort of system with different smaller towers, so you could still cross and go in between these elements, etc. In the end, we kind of came up with a very, very simple volume, which is this. We said, let's make a very, very high tower in order to have the smallest footprint as possible. And in that sense, we can really try to only use, I thought it was about 18% of the site with our buildings, and the rest can stay open space. So we designed this tower and a sort of secondary tower, a sort of secondary building, which is also the base for a future extension. And basically we said, how can we make a building that every tall building, as you know, has columns and beams in its structural system. But if we can make a building, a powerful building, in which the architectural quality of the building depends on this basic system, then I think we can matar dos pájaros de un tiro, how you say it? Like shoot two birds in one shot or something. No? And we can really, really also answer to their demand to make a very, very efficient building. And I think the efficiency could be then exactly there, where like there's a sort of the architecture and the sort of aesthetic drive, the constructive system are one and the same. Sort of competition images. Of course, we kind of imagined this building as sort of a modern, contemporary obelisk in relation with the classical obelisk, which was on the plaza just in front of the avenue. This building is sort of open grid structure. To a certain height, we can imagine that in a building you have a direct relation with the street. You can still hear things. You can still have a direct relationship with what's going on the plaza, and then from a certain height, from 6, 7, or 8 levels high, you have a relationship with the city as an overall on more sort of horizon. So from that moment on, we kind of imagined that a second skin would protect the building from the heavy sun. And this second skin, I mean, 5 more minutes, I'll go much quicker. This second skin, of course, we all know that as architects, it's a very easy trick. You can put whatever in there. It allows you to have offices, terraces, archives, or machines in there, and it will not affect your architectonical image. So that's how we imagined it. We also made it the highest tower of Caracas. Here they kind of exaggerate with the Photoshop a little bit in my studio. Okay, and these are like the development of the project. Another one, very simple small pavilion we did on in the Zócalo, Mexico City. Also a thing we were asked to design and build in a very limited time. And it was really unclear what would really be the program of this building. They wanted to have a temporary pavilion to represent Mexico on a culture fair. But we kind of had understood from the beginning that nothing will ever be presented in there. So we kind of tried to make it as itself, the building as itself, a sort of experience. The structural system, so it could be built very easily with just 3 facades. You make them horizontally and then lift them up. Mexican style, you know, like. And then there's the building, sort of very simple wooden pavilion in which the structure itself, what is defined by the structural engineers as necessary, becomes sort of the powerful image. Actually, this is one of the images I like best. It almost becomes like sort of a woven basket. No? The roof structure, also all defined out of. And then the last point, geometry. I quickly show this image of Bramante because I think it's interesting. Actually, the architecture is this part, these irregular parts. Everything, the architecture is the interface between like what really the will is of the architect, a sort of idea that he wants to have a square patio opening, and actually the external conditions. And the architecture is this interface that kind of defines this. It's actually very beautiful also in all the Islam architectures. Is all these mosques, they have to be directed straight to Mecca, so they never, their geometric direction never fits in with the city texture. So here it's very interesting. This is Sinan, one of the mosques by Sinan. A competition we won in September. You see, it's a very strange competition because we were asked to kind of redo an auditorium that's already there. This is the existing thing, and it's beautiful. It's just in front of a pyramid. And I think here the architecture, the geometry is not a sort of geometry we kind of impose, but the geometry is basically finding these corrections of existing lines on site. As you see, the main pyramid of an archaeological site is here, which kind of creates a sort of axis here. And this new auditorium they built somewhere in the 80s is this huge blocky thing, and it kind of doesn't relate in a sort of comfortable way with this pyramid. Here you see, actually that's the building. It's like this huge white mass in color, in form. It doesn't seem to relate. So basically what we had to do, we said, okay, let's continue the existing shape of this eccentric form. Let's make it a bit more precise, a bit more geometric, and then let's move the entrance so there becomes a really, really direct relation between the new and the existing pyramid. And here you see that a bit from the other side. So these 2 volumes, although this theater hall is a big hall, but these 2 volumes, they kind of have a relation in texture, in size, and they're on the same compositional axis. Last one, I know I'm over time already, but we had to do a small champagne tea room. It was a bit of a strange proposal. On the top of this house, we were asked to make a sort of open space to have like afternoon tea and champagne. And we said, if we have to work on this project, we have to work on a very specific detail. It's a very small project. Why don't we try to design one single tile, and with this tile, we try to resolve the whole interior feel of this building. So we designed this tile with these 2 different colors. And we said, if we join all these tiles together, we can create these lines. But they're designed in such a way that if we turn this one around, we could kind of turn these lines around. So they become like sort of very, very simple, playful tool in which we can make sort of more longer combinations, or we can even make sort of cross shapes, or we can even make all like little square, black squares, etc. If we then move that also, we don't not only use it on the horizontal surfaces, but we also lift it up onto the vertical surfaces, then it becomes much more complex. And then all of a sudden these lines, they kind of start to, with this one single tile, all of a sudden all these complex situations start to become possible. I always wonder what this image is about, but I remember this is one of the first presentations we did to the client. We said, okay, let's use these tiles and let's have everything up until like 1.20 meters or up until 3 or 4 feet, very dense, very complex, a lot of table legs and chairs and these patterns, and everything above at eye height we keep it very simple and wide. So it stays visually more or less relaxed, the space. And that's basically what happened. I mean, the client never really understood it and started hanging like animal heads everywhere. But basically, it's still a bit the same idea. No, that the layer under the layer below this certain border becomes very dense, and while the upper part is more calm and relaxed. Yeah, that's it. More or less in time.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like first to thank Rodolphe and Adip for this invitation to this really great symposium. I am part of a very, very young office called Damiani & Go Phiffer. It's a partnership that we have formed last year, actually. And I have practiced before in other collaboration, but when I received the email from Adip saying you are invited to a Young Ancient Symposium, are you interested? I was kind of insanely happy. I didn't know why. I discovered why while doing this presentation. My partner, Roberto Damiani, he was very unhappy. He said, I don't like it. I don't want to go. Let's not do it. This is how they used to call me in faculty when I was in school. In the end, we came to terms, and we worked on this topic of aggregations and what does it mean today. And I'll have to say that there are a couple of themes that we are very much interested every time we are approaching a project. And one of the themes is the continuity of the city. And I'll have 2 projects to speak more in depth about what are our thoughts about this idea. And the other one is that of form, and by this I mean urban form, architectural form, and how these two actually work together, and how sometimes one creates the city, how sometimes the other one is the context for that form. And of course, while doing this, preparing this presentation, we constantly, every time we wanted to explain better something, we went back and found something in Rossi work. So in the end, this presentation became, it's going to be a little bit of a dialogue between our work and some of the themes that are present in Aldo Rossi's work. But I guess I have to say that these two images are very essential for us and somehow explain the crisis that we have, that we live through every time we design a project. We have on the left side Miletus, the empirical city, the city that can be measured, the reality is something measured. And on the other hand, we have Villa Hadriana, the ideal city composed out of memories. And we are very, very much in love with this second example. We work a lot with images, with metaphors, with symbols, but at the same time, we somehow order them. And what you see here, it's a drawing by our partner, Tom and Go, a drawing called Work and Home. And I think this is the perfect image of our process, of our thinking, this overlay between something which can be measured, its order, and memories. Of course, when we looked at Rossi and when we investigated his work and trying to somehow to position ourselves vis-a-vis Rossi through our work, and I think to be part of to be in line with the young Asians idea, we are very, very much in love with this image where you see actually a juxtaposition between the flux of life, something that is continuous, and then the urban form that is somehow framing this flux. So I would like to show you two projects that we did. The first one, it's a competition we won about 5 years ago, a competition for Europan. This is a competition which is run every 2 years. And every 2 years, there are about 50 sites around Europe which are offered for young architects to compete. In that particular year, we decided to work on this site in Nuremberg, a very, very beautiful site composed out of private lands, agricultural lands that were acquired by the city. And you can see here our site, how it sits in the context of Nuremberg. And the competition asked for 300,000 square meters of program, which included housing for 3,000 people, plus the amenities. And the most important thing was that the city was planning an extension of the subway line, east-west, and having one subway station right here on the site. And more, the brief was strongly recommending the competitors to build on the north side of the site and keep the south side open. We usually, when we start a competition, we go through almost parallel processes. One of them is actually simply testing what those 300,000 square meters look on the site, and what actually could work best. And at the same time, we go through this scale comparison where we test different precedents, different urban fabrics, just to understand the site and what are the possibilities. And sometimes it happens that the idea or the project comes from one of these scale comparisons. But in this case, the way that we decided to organize the project was in a very, very straightforward manner. And I'll say it was an idea full of constraints. Basically, we are going to run a street, and this street is going to organize the build form, the open space is going to be the dictator here. And you see here in this master plan how we have designed a street that runs in the middle of the site and that starts to has all the build form aligned at the street. You see the landscape, and basically here you have the subway station. Another constraint that we have worked with was that all of the buildings are going to be the same height. And based on the previous study on the massing, we realized that actually we can plan and we can design all the types based on G plus 2 floors height. And what that's meant is it meant that every time we needed to design a big building, we had to design it horizontally. And you see here the collection of the different types that we have designed, from the individual housing to the public buildings. And then what this has meant that actually the program starts really to activate the whole site. And you see these long buildings actually extending into the site and activating the landscape. And here is it's an overall image of the project. And of course, when one looks at such a project, and ourselves, I won't deny, we looked a lot at these images, and we're very, very much interested in this image of the village, the street, and then all the buildings organized around the street and more or less organically. But I think in the case of our project, the street has become not something nostalgic, has been something very, very, very strategic. And we always like to refer to this street Via Giulia, where actually you have the street, the public space that starts to reorganize the private space. And that's what I think we try to do. We run this street, and actually it reorganized the private properties on the site. And of course, in this figure ground, you see our project, how it fits into the whole urban structure. And one has to ask himself about what is new, what is old, what is the new city, what is the old city, and how they interact. And the way that Rossi speaks about it in his science notebooks, he speaks about the new city, how it's superimposed on the old city, but actually in such a manner that it doesn't disrupt the horizontal perception of the city. And I think with our project, we have tried to design a village that actually works with the surroundings, that blends into the context. And again, going back to Rossi, every time we look at this image, I wouldn't say we cry, but we are very, very much influenced by what we see here, by this continuity with the context, with the landscape, but at the same time, the presence of also the quiet presence of the form. This elevation of the single family housing by Rossi, quite beautiful. There is something that excites me and inspires me. And if one were to look at this project without the caption, without knowing who is the architect, who has done this project, there is a sense of anonymity. You don't know who's the architect. And this detachment from authorship that we see in Aldo Rossi's work is very, very fascinating for us. The idea of working with simple types that actually everybody understands. So I'll continue with the second project, which was a competition in Budapest. Competition we did last year, and actually the competition, there were 5 different competitions for 5 different buildings, and we had to choose between these 5 sites. You see here the site, which is a big park in Budapest, and what we have decided to do is to work on this site on the corner. As a way of engaging with the city and working with the city. We always prefer to work in dangerous situation rather than working in the middle of the park and generating this kind of transparent buildings. And you see here the site plan of our proposal, which is basically a composition of horizontal and vertical elements, which actually is strongly shaped by the program. The program asks for 6 individual galleries, each one with its own theme. And we're quite fascinated about this horizontal dimension of the project, what we could do here, how these galleries will start to interact with the context through different courtyards or passages. And of course, there is the other dimension of the project, the vertical one, which is dictated by another part of the program that require more light, such as offices. And then you see here in the ground floor plan how we have tried to work the 6 fingers with the context by actually having passages or introducing different spaces, urban spaces that will start to negotiate with the site. And this is the arcade that runs parallel to the street and actually produce, you know, an interface with the city, but at the same time, that space that in between. And then here is a view of the passage in between 2 galleries, dominated by the vertical tower and going into the park. And of course, there are strong relationships between this project and a project such as this by Rossi, Galaratese. But I think the difference between the two is that Rossi really works with abstraction here. There's absolutely, I would say there is no detail, almost the beginning of minimalism. And in our cases, we have tried to give, if you want, a little bit of depth to that abstraction, and we worked with brick, and we wrapped this object in brick because, let's say, as much as we are interested in an intellectual project, we are also very much interested in the phenomenological project. How do we experience the space? And you see here an elevation that speaks more about the atmosphere that we try to generate with the project. And here, how it sits on the corner in its totality, with the arcade, with the towers. And going back to the first slide with the Villa Hadriana and then Miletus, this project was also very much driven by the work of Carl Andre. And when I look at this image, I see here very strong compositional rules, and rules that interest me, rules of how you can compose the vertical and the horizontal. We have never been interested in the diagonal. But at the same time, going back to why we chose the site on the corner, because we're interested in creating a piece of the city. The corner, it's a very, very interesting site for us. It's where actually you start to establish a connection with the rest of the city, but you also have to think about how you can generate a landmark. And of course, these examples from Manhattan, this end of the blocks with the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimensions were work as a reference for us. And you see here the project inserted in the city. And we tend to do this type of imagery where we do our best to really achieve a more or less realistic image of the project, because we are interested in testing the idea of continuity and how this project really works in the context. And we like to believe that our project somehow it's a good example of this idea of continuity of the city with the towers that make reference to maybe these two towers on the corner, the landmark, and this horizontal, which actually starts to interact with the ground condition. And speaking more about the continuity of the city, but actually also about the urban form, the architectural form, I'd like to share very quickly with you our entry for this mega competition for the Guggenheim in Helsinki that we have decided to participate just as a challenge. And what you see here, it's an image of the site. The site, it's here on the waterfront, on the docks, right behind the red boat. And here you have half of our proposal. We have decided to occupy the site of the Guggenheim with a park with different art installations. And this is a park that established this connection with the existing park. And this is the other half of our proposal. This is the container of art. This is our proposal for the museum. A boat that I think still falls within the category of how do you establish a continuity of the city. We haven't done this, we didn't do this project just out of fun because we wanted to do a boat and etc. The site itself allowed us to think about such a scheme. And of course, there is also a strong relationship with the rhetorics of doing the Guggenheim museum. What is iconic? What is art? Is the architecture more powerful than the art that it's hosting? But for us, it was very fascinating, actually, especially knowing that we are going to participate in a competition where everybody is going to abuse the form. We found more calm to work with something that is existing with a refurbished row boat. And that allowed us to think differently about the site. What is our site? And the Baltic Sea became our site. Here is the Guggenheim Helsinki arriving in Copenhagen. Here is the Guggenheim Helsinki docked in Tallinn. And here is the Guggenheim in the Finland archipelago, and under the name 1 Week Landscape Painting Workshop at the Guggenheim Helsinki. We found the possibilities that such a proposal opens were extremely fascinating. But ultimately, it comes down to this image and to the relationship to the city. I guess our project is it's a commentary on the city itself as a visual and social experience. And of course, I'm going back to Rossi. And it's very unintentional, but I also wonder why Rossi was on all of the posters that were sent to us, and kind of while we're developing this presentation, we're receiving the poster and seeing, okay, actually, we really speak about the team. We always connect with Rossi, but I think a fascinating question is, was Rossi a young Asian? And I'll argue so, because only a young mind will propose such a beautiful project. Thank you very much.
So good evening. I'm delighted to be presenting alongside these panelists, and I will be really representing a collaborative endeavor. the work of the office, which is a collaboration between el-Khoury and myself, our partner Carlos Berrios, and a number of incredibly talented collaborators, some of which I see in the audience, and I would like to thank, including Catherine O'Sullivan, Jan, Nicolas, Ed Laird, Una, and really a host of collaborators that have worked with us over the years, without which we really could not present the work today. So this map describes both the geographic and cultural context of our work. And as you can see, Miami is in the center of the image. Miami is arguably a city in between two worlds. A city that, when viewed from the academic centers of the Northeast, seems like an exotic province. But when viewed from the South, from Latin America, it's seen as a capital. So in a sense, it's a city that's either at the edge or the center, depending on your frame of reference. And as such, it's a city that is continuously reinventing itself. The Caribbean, which by extension is the sort of cultural and geographic context in which Miami participates, has also had a defining role in the configuration and the constitution of the city. And while there are certainly differences between these places, the natural and built landscape of these cities, the expansive skies, the emerald green seas, the sponge-like geology, and the fantastic flora and fauna are all shared phenomena. You see, for us, this is a world full of light and scorching heat that could only be painted into intense blues and greens. It is a magical world of overlapping cultures, a place where the transcendental encounter of the olive and the corn took place, and where the impulses and traditions of multiple cultures cross one another. And this confluence produces a hybridization, a kind of mestizaje, or a blending that you can see both in the people and in the built environment. I present this because this is really the world that we come from. So Adib and I spent our formative years as students, young students of architecture in Miami, and returned here to establish and pursue our architectural and teaching careers. So in a way, our own personal histories are also linked to the DNA of this place, being Cuban and Colombian respectively. And while we embrace all that makes our geographic circumstance unique and even vibrant, we're not blind to the city's shortcomings. And we are fully aware that much of Miami is being built quickly and cheaply, and that little consideration is often given to the ways in which individual buildings constitute the construction of a city. For us, this discussion involves the perhaps less glamorous, but the more fundamental, we believe, discourse that includes the relevance of type, or more specifically, perhaps our own interest in archetype, the composition of the urban realm, the desire for permanence, the idea of craft, and dare I say, the pursuit of beauty. So when reflecting upon our own work for this panel, I realized that we seem to be in a constant search to root our buildings in a culture of place. We are interested in sustaining and progressing a cultural discourse so that architecture as a discipline may continue to be socially significant in an ever-changing and complex time. Despite the myriad of external inspirations that we find all around us, I would say that we are still most interested in architecture as an autonomous discipline. And we find inspiration both in the vernacular and in the academic, in the ancient and in the contemporary, in the commonplace, maybe even the mundane, and the extraordinary. And perhaps due to our own reality, we are able to coexist very comfortably in these two seemingly opposed worlds, being open to finding beauty in differences and always drawn to what makes something unique. As a result, we are constantly asking ourselves, what is it that is culturally resonant about a place, and how can the work reflect this? And as such, you will see that the work of the office is varied in terms of language and changes depending upon its specific context. So I'm going to try to walk you quickly through a series of projects that I hope can elaborate the ways in which we've begun to pursue these ideas. The first project that I will present is Oak Plaza. It's the design that took place in the, or that takes place in the design district. You can see it here, the arrow on the upper part of the screen. And it's a tiny little dot on this map, but the map actually pointed out or highlighted all of the existing public spaces or public open spaces in the city, because we were interested in pointing out that, in fact, Miami in general has a kind of gross lack of public open space, and what could we do in this project to sort of contribute to that larger effort. From the onset of the project, the challenge became, or at least the challenge for us, was how we would define a sense of place in an environment that lacked any clear architectural or urban definition. And so for us, the clear sculpting of architectural form, both at the scale of the architecture and at the scale of the urban realm, was very, very important. The existing site, so this is a plan of the site, was actually, or a plan of the project, was actually a vacant parcel, which was covered in asphalt and was being used as a parking lot. But within it stood this sublime landscape of mature white oaks. And really our desire from the onset was to preserve those oaks and to try to create a sort of center for the district by creating the first public open space in the neighborhood. I think something that might be interesting to just state in the context of this presentation is that the client, which in this case was Craig Robbins, who was a developer, actually hired two independent architectural firms, our firm and the firm of el-Khoury and Vogt. And we were asked to work alongside the pedestrian street that was actually proposed as part of the master plan by Dwani Platter-Zyberg. And rather than working in isolation, we decided to really engage in a kind of urban conversation across from one another, feeling that if we were able to establish similarities, we would be able to create a more memorable streetscape. And so what we did basically is that the buildings on either side of that street employed similar architectural elements, including a covered colonnade, which we feel is very, very important, particularly when developing an urbanism in a tropical environment. We also worked with a similar palette of materials, stucco and concrete and cement tile, and we even proposed a kind of coherent lighting and landscape scheme. Now, the second part of the project, if you will, was the development of what we called Oak Plaza. And this part of the project we engaged in independently. Our desire, as I mentioned earlier, was to transform the existing parking lot into an urban carpet of Caribbean oolitic limestone. And this use of material was important to us because it linked this particular space to the civic building traditions of Miami, and it allowed us to have a connection in a way to the geological region in which the project took place. Because we wanted to preserve all of the existing trees, from the onset, we had to develop a project that relied on thinness. So we developed essentially a bar building that was 18 feet wide on one side and a loggia that was about 12 feet wide on the other. And this allowed us to create a continuous frontage along a parcel that up until that point had been fronted by the side of one building and the back of another. And in doing so, we were able to carve out what we considered to be sort of urban room. So when it came to the design of the actual building, we employed Miami's vernacular, which was, in our mind, the use of concrete and stucco. But in the end, we decided to clad the buildings in brilliant glass mosaic tile. Now, the references to the tile cladding are associated with figurative traditions that we can find more closely in places like the Caribbean, but also in faraway places like Thailand. And for us, the gradations of the colored tile generated a rhythm of changing effects that resulted in a kind of dematerialization of the building's surface. And while we cannot constitute this facade as a lightweight curtain wall construction. For us, it did constitute a sort of free facade in the sense that the visual quality of the surface was seen independent of the wall's tectonic conditions. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, we believe that the intense use of color and the reflective quality of the material would allow the buildings to be both cleansed by the incessant rains and protect themselves from the strong light of the tropics, a light that is violent, in fact, and that weathers most surfaces. The tiled surfaces were also meant to be read as a kind of urban mural, like playing on the district's role as a kind of art or design district. This interest in tactility and surface also spread to the horizontal plane, where we developed a series of details using local stones. We used both keystone and oolitic limestone of varying dimensions and slightly different colors. And actually, as I was preparing this, I realized that the kind of concentration on the horizontal surface is always present in the work, particularly when we're working in the public realm. And so these are just a few examples that I inserted of a series of designs that we did for 5 public spaces for a competition in Barranquilla, where we were finalists. Unfortunately, we didn't win, but it was still a very interesting exercise to engage in, because we believe that really it's the public realm or the urban realm that should be invested with the most degree of detail and care. So in the end, this was a relatively modest project. It was a small project, but it taught us a lot, and we hope that it created a memorable street and an outdoor public room. We wanted to offer to the city a distinct and coherent urban architecture, an architecture that would ultimately illustrate our fundamental belief that architecture is first and foremost a civic art. Now, sadly, the Plaza was demolished about 2 years ago, and in place is a new Hermes store. So I'll let you think about what that might be. But the next project is a project on the other side of the city, which is a project called MDO. And the project is actually located along Calle Ocho, or Southwest 8th Street, which is a street that runs from on the west to here on the Everglades, runs all the way to Biscayne Bay. Our site takes place here, which is really amidst probably one of the bleakest kind of suburban landscapes, surrounded by office parks and surface parking lots. And the street really is a street that's dominated by commercial signage, and where the signage is, of course, cleverly placed to be able to be viewed first and foremost from the car. So we began the project at the height of the Great Recession, and what that meant is that we had a very limited budget, we had a less than optimal site, we had a very stringent building and zoning code, and we had already had a pre-selected builder. So you might ask yourself, why would we take this project? We probably asked ourselves that a couple of times along the way, but the reason that we took it on is because we had an unconventional client, which is so important in the development of a practice, someone who wanted to develop a building that would essentially redefine their retail brand, and as a result, kind of transform their existing context. So we took it on. We also wanted to be confronted with the challenge of designing in a, perhaps not an idealized Miami Main Street, but really be confronted with dealing with all the quotidian elements of that rather bleak suburban landscape and see what could occur. This is a site plan of the project, where you see that it's a simple rectangular box that's been pushed to the front of the street, displacing the parking lot to the rear. And here you see the 2 plans of the project. The project is, has a kind of 55-foot span, and we decided to use sort of double T's to make that span, which is the typical construction element for stacked parking garages in that area. And we developed a sort of architecture of a thickened wall. So the entire perimeter of that main space, which is actually used as a retail store, is lined with approximately 5,000 suits. So we were sort of investigating the possibility of thickening the wall using all of the conventional elements of concrete block and concrete columns and concrete double T's, which is really what assembles much of the architecture of that area. Here you see a section And really, perhaps what I would highlight here is just that we were interested in a contrasting spatial experience. Most of the spatial experiences in this part of the city are limited to 8-foot 6-inch high, sort of deep, dark, cavernous structures that are artificially lit. And we wanted to provide perhaps the opposite, a kind of unexpected double height volume that could be naturally lit and in direct juxtaposition to that existing context. So as I mentioned earlier, we started this project at the height of the recession, and so by sheer necessity, we adopted a kind of architecture of restraint where we only worked with a few elements, which included the sign that you see at the upper left of this drawing, which is now placed on a blank wall, sort of separating it from the kind of chaotic landscape of signage and in a way making it more exceptional. And then we depressed the first floor in a way for pragmatic reasons, in essence, to protect those that were entering the store, but we were also interested in inflecting it to give a greater sense of like body or thickness, if you will. Here is the front elevation, recently completed. This is the south elevation, side elevation, which I guess is self-explanatory. This is a detail where we basically had one window to work with on the south elevation. And so what we did is we poured a very deep concrete frame so that just at that one moment, so that we could set the glass back as far as possible so that we could actually get a deep shadow, once again playing off or contrasting against the pervasive thinness of the rest of the construction that surrounded us. The rear elevation, I would say, is the most utilitarian of elevations, and it's the one where we collect all of the generic elements of the neighborhood. So we have the external downspouts and the typical casement windows and the typical aluminum frame doors, and they're all composed, but in this particular case, in a highly restrained and symmetrical way. This is the interior. This is the building by day and night. And here it is set against the context that I was describing earlier as you whiz by on Southwest 8th Street. This is a tiny project, which was for the restoration of an existing historic house in Coral Gables. And I point to it because when we started this project, we came across a text by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who is a leading Florida conservationist, and she spoke about the very discrete elements that were what made this architecture, the architecture of Coral Gables, special in effect. And what she focused on was the undulated surfaces of the stucco. And she talked about the clay roofs that are formed on the tiles of the Cuban workers. And she talked about the way that light plays off of the wooden windows. And I say this because this resounded in our heads. In this project, really what we wanted to do, and it was interesting to hear the previous presentation because we were perfectly fine with architectural anonymity. In fact, we felt that if we could complete the house, restore it back to a sort of architectural wholeness, we would have done our task, if you will. And so what we did is we worked very, very meticulously in being able to restore all aspects of the house, including the ways in which the stucco was applied, the kind of arduous removal of all of the tiles, which produced this kind of watercolor-like effect. And this, of course, extended into the restorations of the interiors. In this particular case, this was an addition of a porch that was originally proposed and never built. And it went all the way down to the production of hardware and the design of the surfaces for the floors. And in a way, while we were working on the project, the voice of Vincent Scully, who was a formidable teacher, as many of you know in the room, and taught here for more than a decade, and Adib and I sat in his classrooms, and we remembered him saying this on multiple occasions, that an architect needs to know when to shout and when to be silent. And so perhaps for us, this was the opportunity for us to remain quiet. So the next two projects, which I'll just quickly go through, are actually in Guatemala. Much of our work recently has taken place in Guatemala, and we've been traveling there fairly consistently over the last 2 years. And this is actually a project that is quite new, and it came about as on one of our trips. and we are currently working on a large corporate headquarters, which I will show you in a moment, but this headquarters is located alongside a number of informal settlements in the southern part of Guatemala. These are kind of rural communities, very, very poor communities, and so because of our interest in the cities, we wanted to actually walk into these sites, and we realized that there are a number of hundreds and hundreds of children that are actually going to school in inhospitable conditions where no child should be. And so we wanted to discuss this, and there was a leading non-for-profit that was working in the area, and so we decided to work with them to try to develop a prototype for a new classroom building that they could then deploy in different parts of these rural communities. And so I'm showing you really a kind of progressive way of thinking about how they can develop a modular system for a classroom unit that can then be aggregated. It could be composed in a number of ways, including outdoor spaces, or be, you know, highly repetitive in terms of its cellular units. We had absolutely no budget, as you can imagine, and so we could only do what was absolutely necessary. And what was absolutely necessary is that we had to protect these children from, you know, the incessant rains and the intense heat, but we had to do this in what we hope to be a sort of dignified and elegant structure. And so we produced a very, very deep overhang. At first, we even had columns, in fact, on those deep outside colonnades that we imagined could double up as classrooms. Those were also removed, and they were bracketed back to the structure, editing and editing and editing it down until we could arrive at the sort of fundamental collection of parts. So this is the section. This is one area in which these 2 or 3 of these units will be placed. This is a longitudinal elevation of one of those prototypes. Here is a sort of rendering. And I inserted this only because, in a way, we were talking about the surfaces earlier, but I've also found that there's this preoccupation with the idea of the roof. And perhaps it's because of our life in the tropics, where we're constantly feeling the need to protect ourselves from that intense light. This is actually a very bad photograph of a recent trip. This is the building under construction. It's not sexy, it's not photoshopped, it's not even like polished. It was just taken at the site, but I decided to include it because it's really a project that is being executed and being done so quite quickly. I'm actually gonna just jump to this last project, which is, this is actually the reason why we've been traveling to Guatemala, and we've been asked, or we were asked by a local sugar mill if we would actually develop a corporate headquarters for the company. This is a growing sugar mill, and what's happening is that they are working all over this very, very large parcel of land in a series of isolated buildings. And what this is causing is that no one speaks to one another. And so the kind of creative energies of the different departments never have an opportunity to overlap. And so the brief asked us to design a building that could house 400 employees under one roof. This is an image that I show you. Of course, this is a detail of one of those fabulous temples in Guatemala. And when we saw this image, we were struck by the quality of light in Guatemala because it's almost always directly overhead. So with very, very little projections, you can get very dramatic shadows on the buildings. Something very, very different, in fact, than the way in which light works here in Miami. This is the location of the site, so just south of sort of extraordinary volcanoes, around 2 hours south of the capital. And this is the area of the, let's say, mill. This is a framed view of kind of the leading entrance to the building. And you can see the building here. The building is actually oriented the way in which buildings have been oriented in this region for centuries, with the principal elevations facing north-south in order to capitalize on the cross breezes. It's set within a precinct, and so we've developed a series of gardens in addition to the main building. So essentially that campus-like setting extends to the perimeter of the site. This is a plan of the building. We had to develop a kind of modular structure. It would allow us to occupy the main room, which seats 300 people, and then a series of conference rooms. If I work from left to right, there's an auditorium. There's that large belvedere, which provides a framed view of the Volcán del Fuego. And then there's the entrance reception. There's the large hall, archives, and then sort of services at the rear. And this is the mezzanine structure, where you also have 140 workspaces up here on the mezzanine, and then some offices back here, sort of reading room and a great cafe with a view out to the north, which is the sort of emblematic views to the volcanoes. This is that, the longitudinal section where you can see the carving of that main volume. And this is an image from the site, and it's focusing on the staircase, but really it's in part because the client challenged us to think about how the building could be used in different ways and how workers could gather in different locations to engage in different types of interactions. We've had and been fortunate enough to be able to work on all aspects of the building, including down to the design of the tables and even the design of the lamps, which has given us a kind of extraordinary opportunity to work at a variety of scales. This is actually a small cafe. It's going to be housed in the middle of the building. The elevations of the buildings are composed of sort of formed concrete at the base and a kind of continuous stuccoed wall above, and a large metal roof that culminates in a lantern which emits natural light into the space. These are a series of views that are created in the office using a variety of medium. Drawing is important to the office. We don't use it only as a method of representation, but actually as a way of thinking. And we use multiple medium, which allows us to think through the project and also to represent it. This is actually an image, and in fact, these individuals in the front of the image, this is not a neo-colonialist conceit. This actually does happen. This happens on the day in which they're going to cut the sugarcane, and the locals actually will dress in this kind of native costumes, and they'll march through the sugarcane fields with the Virgen de Rosario till they arrive, in this case, in a kind of future setting. Here we see the building set against the landscape of the volcanoes. And so for us, it was important to kind of depict a moment in time, a moment in space. This is actually that same day, but at the end of the day, in the gardens, right? After the festivities, the flowers are still on the ground, and the sugarcane has been cut. And this is actually where the building stands, right now from a recent trip, where you can at least begin to see that kind of large volume, which is really at the heart of the project as it's being constructed. And this is a model that represents the full project, I guess, against the Guatemalan moon. And I guess I'll leave it there. Okay.
This is great. I really, really enjoyed this, and I'm happy to see that we had, I think, the right intuition in putting the three of you together, because I find very interesting similarities and divergences which may provoke some interesting discussion. I want to start with the most obvious, what is ostensibly a similarity between the three of you and the work that we saw. Basically, the kind of the formal affinity, the predilection for the orthogonal, for the simple forms, etc. It seems like just as now we know that we can do anything with digital fabrication, CAD/CAM, etc., that anything goes, freeform is possible and also economical. That when we know that we can do anything, you are telling us that this is precisely why we shouldn't, and you deliberately choose to restrict the palette, to impose constraints, to demonstrate a very disciplined restraint, right? So I would like to know more about that. Is it a moral position? Like, for instance, when I see your brilliant Helsinki proposition, I think perhaps it is, because everybody had a negative reaction to. I think all the critics had a negative reaction to this competition. This was a good competition. It generated a lot of interest. We should be excited about such enthusiasm, but actually there was a backlash, because it was just the orgy of of invention, the formal intricacy, the virtuosity was just too much. And like, for instance, in the ship, which I see as a recycled artifact, I see a kind of resistance to this consumerist frenzy. So that's one possible.
I mean, I can say on one hand, our choice to work with simple and straightforward forms has to do with the reaction with what is going on outside right now with this out-of-hand NURBS manipulation in Rhino. But I think on the other hand, it's also dictated by the condition of the project, by budget, site, program, and at the same time I will argue for affinities, personal affinities that we have. Sometimes we simply like more the square than the, undefined form. In the case of Guggenheim, for us was more, we knew that, to quote you, is going to be an orgy of invention and of forms. And yeah, very opportunistically we thought, okay, how we are going to stand out in this sea of proposal, 1,700 proposals. And at the same time, we realized that there are so many objects that already exist outside that we don't need to invent something new. We can actually reuse something that makes sense with the site and that actually pushes what could be the next type of museum.
Just a comment on that. Now that free form is possible and economical, you say, I don't believe that. I mean, I think maybe it's the other way around. Maybe after like many years of tryouts, we have seen that free form is not that easy and is not that economical. No, I think that's a very important aspect. But on the other hand, I do not believe that that's the reason why we have this affinity with Platonic forms. Right. I mean, if you give my dear friend here like an enormous budget, he will still make a blocky thing. No, he will still make an Aldo Rossi building, I think. And I think it's important to see that it is not just a sort of disappointment in digital culture that drives this ethos we talked about. I think there's really also, I mean, to speak for myself, there's really also a sort of, you cannot find yourself in a lot of these things. And I think a lot of things you compare it when you watch a movie or when you read a book, if there's some things that kind of relate to your personal experiences, to your personal experience as a sort of experience of a city or experience of a culture, then a variation on that theme could really be a very important aportación, a very important, my Spanish is getting better than my English, a very important addition, very important, and I think that's why a lot of this, this ethos is there where it is now. A lot of this attention is there where it is now.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, or maybe by extension for us at the office, I think maybe it also has to do with always thinking about the individual object in light of the overall city. Because in essence, I mean, 90% of the city is in fact fabric. And so there, of course, are moments of, kind of extraordinary monuments or gestures, and certainly a moment for, kind of great, say, formal invention, perhaps. But I think when you think about the collective consciousness or the collective memory of a city, I think oftentimes many of the buildings can actually, are more important when they actually come together to form the collective. And so I think sometimes it's difficult as architects, because you become so self-conscious when you're creating the work that you feel that every single element has to be this kind of extraordinary gesture. But then when you step back for a moment, if you can attempt to be a little bit less self-conscious and say, well, how does this participate in the making of the greater city, then I think you can make more informed decisions. As far as like the notion of the reticular or the geometry, or I mean, perhaps in my own case, I have a kind of predilection for the wall. Maybe it's because of my own DNA, you know. I mean, maybe it's because of my connection to Latin America, having grown up in Miami. I think, you know, this is a region that has held on to an architecture of wall, perhaps much more so than, let's say, the Northeast or other places, and so has found a way to even develop an architecture of modernity that is intrinsically linked to an architecture of solidity. So I think there is something in that which is, you know, perhaps more personal in nature, but I think still important in thinking about and making architecture.
There's certainly something about as a kind of a common denominator, that this something about the generic, the commonplace that you seem to be all invested in. Actually, it's actually in our mission statement on the website I was reading the other day. It said something about how we are more interested in fabric, buildings that constitute fabric rather than monuments. It's on the website. I find that extraordinary. It's like very, it's courageous to say that, but also I think it goes against the false dichotomy that we see now rehearsed all the time, especially in the debate that is ongoing. I don't know if you are familiar with it, in the New York Times versus Aaron Betsky, etc. This debate between building, the dichotomy between building and architecture, which I think actually merits more scrutiny anyway. So that statement seems to completely undermine that distinction.
Well, I mean, I don't want to suggest that, you know, I don't have an interest or that the monument is not important or the role of the architect, you know, is not critical in the making of cities or architecture. I guess I just wanted to cast the lens that sometimes if you step outside of the immediacy of the project and you try to recall the aspects of the city across time, what is it that has permanence? What is it that continues? What is it that doesn't drop away at the latest fad? I mean, I was telling this to somebody the other day that in my office for a very, very long time, we kept this very, very high stack of progressive architecture magazines, you know, from like 1989 and 1990, 91, 92. And it was really, really interesting because they kept stacking up until we had to move. And then at that point, you have to discard like you do every time you move. And what you realize when you look back is that you don't keep very many of those. I mean, it's only a few that make it past 1 year, and only very few that make it past 5, and almost none that make it past 10. So then the question is, well, what is it about these works of architecture that transcend the test of time, or have sort of speak to us across time? And I think, in my humble opinion, I think it can only be judged, of course, against the context of the city and in the particular ethos of a period, of course. But
as far as I'm concerned, I'm not willing to relinquish the monument.
Neither am I.
But that's another discussion.
But to point to something else, I think right now the danger is that the Platonic form are becoming the new excess, and I'm seeing this increasingly in Europe, and especially the production of the students in the schools and the work of
coming from Belgium.
It's coming
it's
from.
really a problem. I completely agree.
It's
really
coming from. I mean, the influence of Pier Vittorio Aureli. So that's, and I'm seeing it right now, even at the University of Toronto, that the students are so much right now in love with the, with the work of Aureli, and they're.
So you're saying it's not so much as a critical impulse driving this new sensibility, as much as a new, the desire for a new style.
It starts just like with I guess just like with the work of Rossi. It starts with. With a critical view and with a very profound projection of what the city is and how it's designed, of course overlay with what are the personal tastes, but then from outside there's a lot of misinterpretation, a lot of copying without actually understanding what is the meaning of these forms and why you are doing it. And
yes. especially it's problematic, for example, and I know you're going to have him as a lecturer soon, so I hope it stirs up a bit the conversation, in the work of Pier Vittorio, which I think is actually, it's a work of one-liners. And one way or another, I like it. Also, when I talk about my work, I try to talk about this one gesture, and we kind of push it through to the end. So I have a certain affinity with this idea that this architecture is a one-liner. It becomes very powerful, it becomes very readable for students as well. It becomes very easy to talk about because it makes strong, but at the moment when we talk about human beings, when we talk about real cities, the reality becomes much more complex. And I think the way to, how to mediate between this quality of the one-liner and this enormously complex universe we live in, we operate in, and I think that's very problematic. The same topic, I think, also there's a sort of affinity, really sort of affinity with a sort of materiality, and I mean literally the material of a sort of bygone times. And when I'm thinking about and I'm trying to kind of start a little fight here. If I see, for example, the image you show of your partner, of Tom and NGO, and I see this, NGO, I always say, Tom Ngo, then I see this image, and it's a very beautiful drawing, I think. It was called Work and Home. And I see this image on yellow paper with like the edges a bit torn, and I see it's a work from 2010. But it's presented as if it is a sort of a 1970 aesthetics, as if it had been like lying in a sort of old Italian drawer for another 20 years, and somebody found the old drawing and kind of, and I think, and I see it a lot in the world of contemporary, I think it's really problematic. There's a sort of adaptation of an aesthetic of a certain time that is now really in vogue, and there's not this discussion. There's not there, and it's only that this representation which is taken over.
Let me respond to this by actually telling you the whole story of the drawing. This is one of his earliest work, and the story of that drawing is actually about reusing. He found these old maps at the school. That they were throwing away, and actually he decided to reuse them and to draw on the back of them, and.
But regardless of, maybe this is not the right example, but I think
I don't consider your work at all like that.
The point is well
but I think
taken.
there's a problem there.
Right, because I think we at the school here we are a bit guilty of this, actually being fixated on a particular sensibility that developed at that time. And I see that rehearsed in some of the drawings I see around the school, the cultivation of a certain aesthetic. But I think that's only, this is a kind of an epiphenomenon. What is important, and I think what brings you here is perhaps what is kind of the core commitment which is to this city and the kind of city that you are envisioning. For instance, that image you showed of the cover of the Rossi monograph was the window, and I think this was extremely powerful. It encapsulated, crystallized the whole idea about the city, where the architecture provided a kind of enduring framework that enabled certain things, that the flow of life, but is in a way also a bit indifferent to it. Whereas Rem Koolhaas's notion of the city of congestion and his idea about the ideas promoted in Delirious New York, he's thinking of architecture as something that is more, not only just a backdrop or a framework, but something that is much more of an orchestrator of the culture of congestion. So from that developed an architecture that is actively, completely committed to the staging of that flow of life, whereas the idea of the type is completely is the opposite of this notion. I think this is an important issue here. Do you think that, the notion of the diagram, the idea that actually a building emerges from that, the forces that shape the site and is very much responsible for precisely orchestrating the use and the inhabitation of the program? Do you think that notion has failed the city in a certain way to provoke your challenge, to go back to a more mute framework, to types that have evolved over millennia, let's say, and not things that have to be concocted as particular solutions to particular circumstances, right?
I guess I'll have to respond first. I think there is a big problem with the diagram, and the best example, in my opinion, is the work of BRK Ingalls, that every building and every project is being explained to a series of diagrams, but in my personal opinion, he always ends up with the same project. I mean, and in a way he works with the two types. He takes one type, takes another type, and then he does the loft. And that's the project, and applies some arrows and etc.
You suggested that there is still a typological foundation to
There is still a typological foundation. I mean, both BRK Ingalls and Rasmus Prince Rex in New York, they are both coming out of OMA, and you see how I guess Rex works more by stacking different types, and that's how they design, basically, by putting one on top of the other different plan types. If you look at some of their museum designs, as BRK Ingall is really taking a type and another type and doing the loft. But ultimately there is no there is kind of a sense of tiredness that you get right now with at least with the work of BRK Ingalls. And then more problematic, it's the way that you think about a project. And if you think only through diagrams, it's a very, very simplistic way of thinking about a project. Things are more complex. There are more layers there than what a diagram can.
But maybe that big is maybe an easy target. But let's compare a library by McCamead and White to the Seattle Library, and how they, in terms of their urban makeup, right? So, what do you think?
I'll have to think a little bit.
No, I think we're in a moment now that I think the central position of program, of the spectacle, if you call it in another way, as it was installed by Rem Koolhaas, I think it has lost its power as this generator of architecture for all of us. I think the Seattle Library is a difficult example. I think it's a very powerful building in its, yes. But I think we also have the feeling that these buildings, they should, or that are all our buildings, I think they should be there as well, as a sort of architectural proposal, even without responding specifically to a program. And I think all these I think all the things we've seen today, one way or another, they're allowed to. They could allow the incorporation of other programs. I saw the last pictures of you. There was not even a floor in your building. No, it's already kind of relates in the correct way with the landscape. It creates a space which is powerful in one way or another, and I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think architecture is always a formal act, even if it's veiled in the diagram, or, in my humble opinion, a kind of scientific approach. At the end, you are working with a series of forms that you select and that react to a program and react to a site. So I think it's, despite the kind of theoretical discourse, I think it's always a formal act, and form matters. And I mean, I would agree, though. I think that I think the obsession with kind of program, and then also the lack of conversation about architecture, actually, in schools of architecture. So we spend a lot more time talking about science and talking about how to diagram and talking about how we're going to represent the idea. And very, very little conversation is had about actually the work of architecture. Architecture is...
But that's what at one point you struck me by. It was very provocative. You said something about how I believe that architecture is an autonomous discipline. And that claim was made by the neo-rationalists, of course. But if this is the one claim that I think I would have a hard time to accept, right? Like, what about, like, don't you think? What about ecology? Cybernetics, systems theory, thermodynamics, all of these, don't think they have anything they have no place in the School of Architecture, or?
No, I mean, I guess what I meant, I think there is, I mean, there are great investigations taking place in a number of parallel fields, and you know, you mentioned one, like ecology or the sciences, and I think we should be open in this complex world to listen to, say, experts in this field, but at the same time, in my personal opinion, I don't believe that because the tree breathes and is a kind of natural element, and that the building should be a tree. You know, I think the building should be a building at the end of the day, not a tree. Although I think we should learn.
I like this.
So, I mean, I think we should have many people around the table, and I think that we should be open to these broad and complex discussions, but I guess when I referred to architecture as an autonomous discipline, I said, and maybe it's because I get pleasure personally from being out on a job site where gravity and human error actually prevail, and where the resolution of a corner and the beam and these very, very fundamental and kind of timeless considerations of the architects are still relevant today. And so I guess that's what I meant by...
I mean, I have a question for all of us, for myself. I mean, I saw a very different, especially with you, Adrian, a very different way of presenting the work. For example, I could show the tower we're doing in Caracas, and I could then later show an image of Solowit. We've been thinking on that, and actually we put it on the competition panel as well. But I think it's highly problematic for myself. It's kind of proving, look, what I'm doing is exactly the same what people were doing 30 years ago.
But why it's problematic?
No, I don't know. I think it doesn't.
It's problematic just for yourself.
For myself, you know, it
Okay.
doesn't seem to add. It doesn't seem to. In your case, I think it's very brave. You know, as otherwise, like, look, I do this, yeah, and actually Aldo Rossi did it also. It's like, I'm even a bit. I don't know how to say, but I'm even a bit kind of ashamed when it's too close to my own work. All of a sudden, we kind of discover something, a fantastic landscape design we're doing, and all of a sudden I find this piece of Carl Andre, which is like, for Christ's sake, 40 years old, and he kind of did it twice as good as we did it.
No, but don't you think it's rhetorical in the sense that it is very much taking a position against the fascination with originality, with the new? It is actually making an argument about how knowledge builds upon the elaboration of precedents.
Yeah, but I also don't want to discover that we're running in circles. I do believe there's like cyclical thoughts, but I do believe that architecture is not autonomous anymore. We have incorporated, we got smarter than that. I mean, I want to kind of discover how, in what aspect, and how did we got smarter than what people were like 40 years ago. I think that's very important, because otherwise we can just kind of embrace again, like kind of applaud again this kind of culture, this critical culture that existed in the 70s, and kind of superpose it with the critical culture that exists nowadays. But I want to start to read, where is this difference? Where is this? And it's very hard. It's very hard to kind of.
But in order to acknowledge, to see the difference, you have to acknowledge the legacy.
Of course.
Right.
It's sort of.
I mean, it's just, you know, I don't think the people from the 70s were original. They were just presenting exactly the same thing, speaking about it differently. Also. At least that's the way that I see their work. Of course, extremely intelligent people and very smart. That you know, they go back very, very, very far.
Like sort of universal truths that come back continuously.
And I think the struggle and why maybe you have a sense that we're running in circles is this omnipresence of everything in front of us through, let's say, through Google Images. I mean, I personally, as a personal experience, in the past years, I used to get so sad when I opened a website, a blog like Arch Daily, because I will see everything that I could have ever imagined has been designed, and it's so well designed, and it's like, exactly. Oh, there is actually, you know, I think in a way we have to embrace very strongly our references, even if they come after. I think they
right, but like you know, every school has its vicissitudes, right, and history, and our school's defining moment. It's not necessarily its best moment, but it's certainly its most defining moment was that period, because actually the school was very much an active participant in the creation of that culture. You know, the school made a huge contribution to that moment in history. So the danger in doing this call to order and these lectures is to think of this as, oh, look, I told you so, we were right all along. But exactly what you say. No, the point is to see how can we do it differently now, because now we have learned certain things, and how do we push the discourse? I think it's a very good point. Maybe, okay, we have the burning desire to participate. Now we turn to you. Right.
I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the first project that you showed. One that had a peristyle.
House of Arts in Beirut. House of Arts and Culture in Beirut.
I think the discussion that we're having is typology versus innovation, or the use of typology versus the use of unrestrained imagination. And it's not a mutually exclusive possibility, because the history of typology is always measuring how one pushes the thing. I think that first project that you showed is a beautiful example of that, because it's a peristyle and it's a triple tier of columns, and the columns are actually syncopated. So the intercolumniation is syncopated. And then because the center is displaced, there's an inflection away, there's a compression towards the highway and inflection towards the view. So that's a classic example of how some typological idea can be distorted, or there can be a sense of innovation that is site-driven. And that's as old as the use of precedent.
I mean, it's more about the.
Palladio shows Bramante's Tempietto in his book on ancient edifices. Palladio knew good and well that Bramante lived 80 years before his time, but the Tempietto advanced the typology, so he includes it among the works of the ancients. You see, that's a comment. That typology is in a sense atemporal, but one moves the idea forward with every innovation that that type can withstand.
I think it's more about type versus diagram, where it's different from innovation, where the diagram represents really just a unique condition that the building basically emerges from, sometimes with no design. Like Big is very good at that. Like says, okay, there's this, this, and this, and oh look, it became a building, right? So that's different from the idea of type, which has this notion of an a priori model, right? So
I was wondering whether we feel nervous about the fact that we may be falling into a system that's too self-referential. The system in and of itself is open enough that we shouldn't be concerned about that. The system of precedent and the advancement of any one type.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking about is the timeless discourse of tradition and invention, right? And I mean, T.S. Eliot in that wonderful essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, speaks about how really true innovation is born out of a rich understanding of tradition. I think what is interesting about the conversation, or even about the presentation, is that some of your mentors are revealed, in fact, or your references are revealed, or that we can participate in a broader, richer discussion. I mean, I think we as architects have a lot of angst about this, maybe angst that, for instance, musicians don't have, and maybe it's because they, of course, learn a common language and then they can elaborate on that language. But, I mean, I find it, in a way, sort of refreshing in a school of architecture that one can make reference to one's teachers, one's mentors, and even one's inspirations, because I think it is that constant dance between tradition and innovation that I don't think needs to be adversarial, in fact, because I would personally agree with T.S. Eliot that I think true invention comes from a profound understanding of tradition.
I saw this lecture of Angelo Bucci, the Brazilian architect, and it was exactly that. He stood up in front of his public, he said, look, I come from that area of Brazil. There was Artigas, who built the architecture school. Then Paulo Mendes da Rocha learned stuff from Artigas. Then I learned from Paulo Mendes da Rocha. Okay, now I will present you my work. That was like a sort of 5-minute introduction. This is where it all comes from. And this is very, very much part of that tradition. Yeah. Exactly.
Other questions?
Our practice consists of enabling dozens of architects to work together, not to do the work ourselves. We're fundamentally urbanists, and in many of our projects there have been scores of architects working coherently, relatively harmoniously. And in certain traditions of architecture, it is possible to code proactively, to say proportions are this way, materials are this set of things. Roof pitches or flat roofs or etc. Certain attitudes. In the past 15 years, it's been very difficult to actually code proactively, but very, very easy to code in terms of prejudice. The cohorts of design that have occurred within the generation since the 90s is much easier to code in terms of what can't be done. For example, I remember, I was here in the 70s when the one thing you could not do was a diagonal, period. Anything but. You can also, for example, now there is an incredible prejudice against paint. Anything but paint. We've been through a period in which it was anything but brick. We've been through a period in which you could do a column, but not a vertical column. Any column but a vertical column. And now we're getting on to something in which it's any column that is straight up. No fat columns, no thin columns, but there's a kind of phenomena of a kind of a reversal, a mirror image, in which the cohorts are now identified not by what they propose, because it's really much wider than that, but by why they do not permit themselves to engage in. And I just find it's an interesting phenomenon.
So that's why we're here together, the three of us as well, because we would never do an oblique wall or something. Maybe.
And where is it that you think that comes from, and where is it that you can...
It's actually an interesting proposition to actually have a broader palette rather than a limited one. You basically say, we do not do this, but anything else is possible.
But I guess
it's quite a possible way to actually achieve a city in terms of state connection, to achieve and then some in terms of what is not done. More creative, I think.
identify the common enemy and then allow everything else to be possible? That's interesting.
But I guess in this process, where do you allow for yourself to take over and to kind of to say in my work, I don't use diagonals. It's not something that I impose to others, but it's something that I am not interested in. And I guess it's when you are an urban designer, that's something impossible to do because you have way more responsibilities and you have to, you are not these pure designers that acts just like I like this, I don't like this. But I guess I'm trying to justify myself because I said it, I'm not interested in the diagonal. And you know, it's just a personal preference.
There was a period here in the 70s in which you simply would rather die than do a diagonal. You were completely out of it.
No, but at the same time, I'm not.
Because everything else, because the enemy was postmodernism, which was all about diagonals. You see. So the line had to be drawn. We're not postmodernist. It was before classicism and the advent of classicism. We were defined by a series of things. For example, we went through a period in which every kind of roof could be done, but a symmetrical pitch. You could do an asymmetrical pitch. You could do a vault. You could do an asymmetrical vault. You could do an inland turn. You could do an upside down, anything but a pitch roof. So you said, I can code this. No symmetrical pitch. Let's go. Let's do a town. But this is a very elevated proposition, but it's nevertheless an interesting one. The way we think in terms of what we cannot do. That's how the cohorts seem to be thinking now.
There's a lot to do with style, no? I think, I have a feeling. There's sort of how certain affinities or certain are read from the outside, I think. Yeah. No, of course.
But it's also, it seems it's very dogmatic because when I go into the class, I don't tell my students don't do diagonals.
I do tell they can never
No.
ever use this how you call it, this spider things that holds glass together. That's forbidden.
The
That's
spider.
joints, you know, like, I don't know, for tempered glass.
No, I don't believe in that. Actually, it's you know, I consider my voice part of that big library that I think you are arguing for. But I don't, you know, I don't make out of it a dogmatic idea. You have to follow this. And actually, with my students, it's I'm more looking at them and what they put in front of me and trying to make them speak a coherent language. So.
If you were to do that, you would be a unique professor. You all say that, but no, the students, you know, standing back from the studios are very, very coherent. You know, professors all say they will make students do things, but I've never seen it happen.
I think you're right. It's like, I mean, I completely agree with you. I work the same way, but then a student arrives with the, I don't know, the wrong roof, and I would say, yeah, I'm not so sure. Let's think about several other options. You know?
But no, I mean, I personally, when I have this discussion, I'm always searching for the origin. And the question is why this roof and why, what, and understanding the origin of things, it's crucial when I have a discussion with the student. So then when he has absolutely no clue what he's doing, then
I know,
I am like,
but
maybe you should go back to the drawing.
The only one that in the presentation today said, but I don't like diagonals, is you.
Yeah.
You're the only one that kind of did use the strategy of like taking out, I mean, I use a lot of diagonals, so I mean, I think it's a very powerful tool. But so it's strange, it's just one of the tools out of this big library that you kind of clearly manifested, no, this is out of my reach. It's not, I'm not interested in that. It is.
I think it's a critical stance. I'm not interested in it. I'm not interested in columns or diagonal. I'm not interested in random administration.
I'm going to have dinner with him and I'm going to convince him of the diagonal. That's.
I don't know.
Okay. Maybe one more question. Yes.
then it is interesting to ask, because some of these concerns are referring to typology as a solution of getting to less, right? A new emergence of less is more. But there is also a lack of central signifier, right? As we are saying, why diagonal, why not diagonal, or why, for example, this type or not, why that the other type. And when this situation happens, architecture looks for the other, the big other of itself, so it cannot find it. So I think in these projects we are signifying a search for something that does not exist, that there is no such a common thing. For example, in the work of Rossi, if you think of the kind of Italian rationalism, it is all about kind of abstraction of that forms, and then the idea of return to the form, pure forms, right? And for instance, the beautiful example that Rossi says, the Palazzo della Regione, he talks about that building over centuries accommodate different functions or different programs, but the form was so powerful and has established a good relationship with the public realm that the form could accommodate all of those conditions. I think the problem of architecture that you guys are reacting against is this idea of diagram that is resulted from that idea of culture of congestion and the interest in programs. You think, you look at many of firms, they start with program, different way of programming, different way of interpreting program. But at the end of the day, they are again looking to icons in architecture. They are making forms, right? So my question is that how we return to form, but what is the reference of generating forms for you guys? I think that might be a question, although it is a vague kind of a speculation about form as opposed to program. Because I think the main problem is that program has become increasing and reflected in idea of diagramming, become the point of reference of beginning of the design process, that it shouldn't be program, I think.
For me, the answer is very simple. It's really physical context. And this is sort of escapism, because if you talk about physical context, it kind of allows all this, it allows what kind of Rossi pretended to do, you know, like what he pretends to talk about, that a building independent of its program, its function, kind of works. In the same sense, these buildings, they are working in their physical context. They can change the physical, they can change in program, they can change, but I have the feeling, sometimes we try to say, like, when I add this building, before I came to the site and after we finished our building, did this environment become better? I think that's a very simple question to ask, and it's also not an easy question to ask yourself, because, for example, I mean, I've been teaching for a while in Texas A&M. You know, like College Station is the name of the town. It's the crossroad. I think the center of the town, and I mean, the center of the town, I think, is an Applebee's, a U-Haul, an empty lot, and I don't know, Starbucks or something. I mean, whatever Rossi proposes, it just doesn't work. And even what I'm saying now, it's like, I mean, I can imagine that somebody gives me the commission to do something on a plot there. I mean, what do you start off with? Also, I think that's one of the reasons why at certain moments architecture in the US has become extremely self-referential, because it's the only thing there is in certain urban situations, I think. But yes, the context for me, the physical context.
There's another answer to your question, which is now basically this, maybe perhaps displacing program. It's a performance. That's the new paradigm, I think, because of sustainability, ecology, etc. That's really what's now driving the design process at the outset, and I'm equally skeptical, actually. Right.
Fake construction, right? Because performance, for example, the CCTV, Rem says this is all about performance, but it's not all about performance, it's all about iconography. So,
right.
I mean, a singular cover without that void inside actually works better functionally and in terms of performance. I remember your
think it also might have something to do with like common sense, and I think in a like postmodernist era, we are more sensitive to the conversation about sustainability. But so recently, on the last project that I showed you, we've been collaborating with Arab engineers out of New York, you know, which is sort of cutting edge group of engineers which were brought on board, and who actually did very, very little to manipulate the form. But we were having a discussion about the kinds of projects that they're currently working on. And one that they showed was this sort of glass, you know, highly seductive form, a kind of glass, almost kind of undulating form in the kind of desert. And they had designed this incredibly sophisticated performance-based skin that had to kind of wrap around the structure, which again was highly seductive. But then the basic question is perhaps, you know, why the glass tower in the middle of the desert? So all of this form has to be a reaction to the inherent decision to create that glass structure to begin with. So, I mean, ultimately, back perhaps to what I said earlier, I think architecture is, we can discuss it many, many ways, but at the end of the day, it is always a formal proposition. But I think maybe, you know, we could look to, and perhaps, and maybe I'm only speaking here personally, I think perhaps my own interest in these kind of time-tested examples, even some of them that perhaps predate, you know, these highly sophisticated technological systems, which, you know, I'm prepared to engage, but I think what that other tradition brings us is the kind of test of time, you know, and this, dare I say, sort of common sense solutions to the shaping of buildings, right? And not just the application of products. So,
I mean, there is no real answer to your question. I mean, as an architect, I think you always need to make up a story, and because we live in a highly empirical world, you know, you need that story that is going to push the project forward. But in my situation, I think things are so complex. There are so many things that you see. I believe that you should look at the program and believe in the program, because that's your anchor to the present with what you need to do right now. On top of this, of course you overlay your own preferences. And at the same time, you see things, and there are things that you have seen that influence. So, you know, what really drives the moment of creation? It's impossible to be, you know, to be defined. I think I worked at OMA for a while, and we are. Every time we're doing a project, we're kind of trying to come up with this hyper-rational process diagram, and you put the program and you move this, and et cetera, et cetera. And the senior people in the office told us that basically we are a bit crazy if we design just like this, and if we think that when Rem designed the Seattle library, it's just about moving boxes. It's, you know, he's looking like an artist. He's closing one eye, he's looking from this, it has the right proportion, this is beautiful, this is ugly. These are words that were used in the office all the time. And so it's a very, very complex you know, moment when that idea sparks.
Okay, I think it's nice to end like this inconclusively, because with the big difficult questions, because I don't think there's an easy answer to this. So, to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you.